Teen vanished in Yosemite. 9 months later, a park ranger finds this hanging from a cliff. The morning sun cast long shadows across the granite face of El Capitan as Ranger Luis Delgado adjusted his climbing harness one final time. 23 years of working Yosemite's most treacherous terrain had taught him that routine inspections were never truly routine. The mountain always had secrets to reveal. "Another day, another dollar," he muttered to himself, clipping his radio to his belt. The forecast called for afternoon thunderstorms, which meant he needed to finish his cliff inspection before noon. This particular section of granite wall was rarely accessed by climbers or hikers, making it a perfect spot for wildlife nesting sites that required annual monitoring. Luis had been thinking about Maya Brooks more often lately. 9 months had passed since the 17-year-old had vanished without a trace during what should have been a simple solo camping trip. The case had consumed him for weeks after her disappearance, but eventually, like all cold cases, it had been filed away in the depths of the Park Service's unsolved mysteries. Maya's parents still called every few weeks, their voices growing more distant with each conversation, hopes slowly bleeding out like air from a punctured tire. The climbing route took him along a narrow ledge system that most visitors never saw. Here, 200 feet above the valley floor, the world felt different. Quieter. More honest, somehow. The granite held stories in its cracks and crevices, stories of storms weathered, of creatures that had made their homes in impossible places, of time itself carved into stone. It was during his systematic inspection of potential peregrine falcon nesting sites that Luis first noticed something that didn't belong. About 30 feet to his left, wedged deep into a tight vertical crack in the granite, something dark caught the light wrong. It wasn't the usual debris that wind carried up the cliff face, no plastic bag or lost hiking gear. This object had weight to it, substance. What the hell? Luis repositioned himself on the ledge, his experienced hands finding purchase on the rough granite as he traversed toward the anomaly. The closer he got, the more his pulse quickened. Whatever was stuck in that crack had been there for a long time. Sun-bleached and weathered, but definitely man-made. Using his multi-tool, Luis carefully pried the object free from its granite prison. His breath caught in his throat as he realized what he was holding: a cell phone, sealed inside a clear waterproof pouch. The device itself was in rough shape, the screen partially melted from months of intense sun exposure, the plastic casing warped and discolored. But the waterproof seal had held. Luis's hands trembled slightly as he turned the phone over, looking for any identifying marks. There, barely visible beneath a layer of grime and sun damage, he could make out a small sticker on the back of the case. A cartoon llama wearing sunglasses with the words, "Drama Llama," underneath. His heart nearly stopped. He knew that sticker. Maya Brooks had shown it to him during one of the interviews after her disappearance, when her parents had brought in her belongings to help with the search. She'd been proud of that silly little sticker, had bought it at a gift shop in Mammoth Lakes during a family vacation the previous summer. "Maya," Luis whispered to the empty air, his voice barely audible above the wind that perpetually swept the cliff face. He carefully secured the phone in his pack, his mind racing with possibilities. How had Maya's phone ended up wedged in a crack 200 feet off the ground? The last known location of her cell phone, according to the investigation, had been near the mist trail, miles from this cliff face. The search teams had scoured that area for weeks, finding nothing. The descent back to solid ground felt like it took hours, though Luis's watch showed only 45 minutes had passed. Every step down the cliff face was deliberate, calculated. He couldn't afford to slip now, not when he might be carrying the first real clue in Maya's disappearance. Once his feet touched the valley floor, Luis immediately radioed park headquarters. "Dispatch, this is Delgado. I need to speak with Superintendent Chen immediately. Priority 1. The radio crackled back. "Luis, this is dispatch. Super's in Sacramento today. Can I take a message?" "Negative. I need to speak with her directly. Tell her I've found evidence related to the Maya Brooks case. She'll want to hear this." There was a long pause before the dispatcher responded. "Copy that, Luis. I'll get her on the line ASAP. While he waited for the call back, Luis found himself staring at the phone through the clear plastic of his evidence bag. The device looked so ordinary, so mundane. Just another piece of modern technology that had failed when its owner needed it most. But Luis had seen enough missing person cases to know that sometimes the smallest discoveries could crack a case wide open. His radio squawked to life. "Luis, this is Chin. What do you have?" "Superintendent, I've recovered Maya Brooks' cell phone. It was wedged in a cliff face near Sector 7, about 200 feet up. The device appears to have been there for an extended period, but it was sealed in a waterproof case." The silence on the other end of the radio stretched long enough that Luis began to wonder if the connection had been lost. Finally, Chen's voice came back, tighter than before. "Luis, I want you to secure that device immediately and bring it directly to headquarters. Don't discuss this with anyone else until we can determine the next steps. We're going to need to bring in digital forensics." "Copy that," Luis replied, but his mind was already racing ahead to the bigger questions. How had Maya's phone ended up on a cliff face that wasn't even close to her planned hiking route? Had she thrown it there deliberately? Had someone else put it there? And most importantly, after 9 months of silence, what secrets might the device still hold? As Luis made his way back toward park headquarters, the afternoon thunderstorms began to build on the horizon. Dark clouds gathered over the high country, and the first rumble of thunder echoed off the granite walls. The mountain was speaking again, as it always did, but today its voice carried the weight of questions that had waited 9 long months for answers. Maya Brooks had been 17 years old when she disappeared. A straight-A student who loved photography and had dreams of attending UC Berkeley to study environmental science. Her parents had described her as responsible, careful, someone who always followed the rules and checked in regularly. The kind of teenager who researched hiking trails for weeks before attempting them solo. Yet somehow, her phone had ended up in one of the most inaccessible spots in the entire park. As Luis climbed into his Ranger vehicle, he couldn't shake the feeling that Maya's story was far from over. The phone in his evidence bag might look dead and damaged, but Luis had learned long ago that in the digital age, data had a way of surviving even when everything else failed. The first drops of rain began to fall as he drove toward headquarters, each droplet striking his windshield like a reminder that time was always moving forward, even when the truth remained buried in stone. 3 days later, Luis sat in the sterile white room of the Digital Forensics Lab in Fresno, watching as technician Sarah Chin carefully connected Maya's damaged phone to a complex array of recovery equipment. The drive down from Yosemite had given him time to prepare mentally for what they might find, but nothing could have prepared him for the reality of potentially hearing Maya's voice again after 9 months of silence. "The water damage is extensive," Sarah explained, her fingers dancing across her keyboard as diagnostic programs ran their tests. "But the waterproof case did its job better than we hoped. The storage chip is intact, though the connection pathways are severely corroded." Luis leaned forward in his chair, unable to hide his anxiety. "What are our chances of recovering anything useful?" "Honestly? Maybe 30%. Most of the data appears corrupted beyond repair." "But—" Sarah paused, her eyes fixed on the monitor as green bars slowly filled across the screen. "Wait. I'm seeing some intact file fragments. Video files, actually." The next 2 hours felt like an eternity. Luis watched Sarah work with the patience of someone who had learned that rushing digital recovery was like trying to force a flower to bloom. It happened on its own timeline or not at all. Coffee grew cold in paper cups as various software programs attempted to reconstruct Maya's final digital footprints. "Got something," Sarah announced suddenly, her voice cutting through the lab's ambient hum. 7 video files. They're short, none longer than 90 seconds, but they're playable. Luis's throat went dry. "Can we watch them now?" Sarah nodded, pulling up the first file. "Fair warning, the quality isn't great, and there are some gaps where the data couldn't be recovered. But the audio is surprisingly clear." The first video flickered to life on the monitor, and Luis felt his breath catch. There was Maya Brooks, very much alive but looking nothing like the confident teenager from her missing person photos. Her usually neat brown hair was tangled and dirty, her face streaked with grime and what looked like dried tears. She was holding the phone close to her face, and behind her, Louise could make out the dim interior of what appeared to be a tent. "It's my third day out here." Maya's voice came through the speakers, shaky and tired. "Something's not right. I keep hearing things at night, footsteps around my campsite. At first I thought it was just animals, but..." She paused, looking over her shoulder nervously. "The footprints I found this morning were definitely human. Boot prints, size 11 or 12. They circled my tent 3 times. The video ended abruptly, cutting to static. Louise felt a chill run down his spine. "There are 6 more," Sarah said quietly, advancing to the second file. This video showed Maya during daylight, sitting on what appeared to be a fallen log. She looked even more frightened than in the first recording, constantly glancing around as she spoke. "I tried to hike out early, but I think I'm being followed. I can hear someone moving through the brush behind me, always staying just out of sight. I called out several times, thinking maybe it was another hiker who needed help, but..." Maya's voice cracked slightly. "No one answered. They're just watching me." The third and fourth videos showed Maya's psychological state deteriorating rapidly. She spoke of feeling trapped, of being herded away from the main trails by someone who seemed to know her planned route better than she did. In the fourth video, recorded inside her tent by flashlight, she revealed something that made Louise's blood run cold. "I thought it was a bear, but it knew my name," Maya whispered to the camera, her eyes wide with fear. "Someone called out Maya around midnight, trying to get me to come out of my tent. The voice sounded familiar, but I can't place it. Who else knows I'm out here?" Louise paused the playback, his mind racing. According to the original investigation, Maya had filed her backcountry permit under her full name, Maya Elizabeth Brooks. Park staff would have had access to that information, but so would anyone else who happened to see the permit logs. "The last 3 videos are the most disturbing," Sarah warned him. "Are you sure you want to continue?" Louise nodded grimly. He owed it to Maya and her parents to see this through, no matter how difficult it became. The 5th video showed Maya in obvious distress, recorded while she was moving quickly through dense forest. The camera shook with each hurried step, making the footage nauseating to watch. "He's getting closer," Maya panted, her breathing labored. "I can see him sometimes through the trees. He's wearing some kind of uniform, maybe Park Service. But he's not trying to help me. He's hurting me, like I'm some kind of animal. Every time I try to head back toward the main trail, he appears and blocks my path." The 6th video was brief but terrifying. Maya had set the phone on a rock, creating a stable shot of herself as she worked frantically to pack her camping gear. "If something happens to me," she said, looking directly into the camera with the desperate clarity of someone who knows they might not survive, "I want my parents to know that I love them. And I want everyone to know that this wasn't an accident. Someone is hunting me." Louise's hands were shaking as Sarah loaded the final video file. The timestamp showed it was recorded 2 days after Maya's official disappearance date, meaning she had survived at least 48 hours longer than anyone had known. The last video was corrupted and fragmented, the image cutting in and out like a strobe light. But Maya's whispered words came through clearly enough to chill Louise to the bone. "I think it's him again. He's not supposed to be out here." The camera suddenly swung wildly, showing flashes of forest canopy and granite rocks. "He found my hiding spot. I can hear him calling my name again, but now he sounds angry. I'm going to try to hide this phone somewhere safe, somewhere he won't think to look. If anyone finds this..." The video cut to permanent static. Sarah turned off the monitor, and the lab fell into heavy silence. Louis stared at the blank screen, his mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. Maya Brooks hadn't simply gotten lost in the wilderness. She had been stalked, terrorized, and possibly finished by someone who knew the park well enough to track her movements and cut off her escape routes. Someone wearing a Park Service uniform. The realization hit Luis like a physical blow. Maya's finisher might have been one of his own colleagues. Back at park headquarters, Luis spread Maya's original backcountry permit and trail maps across his desk like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that refused to fit together. The videos had changed everything. What began as a recovery mission was now a crime investigation, and every detail from the original search needed to be re-examined through this darker lens. Maya's planned route seemed straightforward enough on paper. She had intended to hike the Mirror Lake Loop on her first day, then venture onto the more challenging Tenaya Canyon Trail system for her remaining 2 days. It was an ambitious itinerary for a solo hiker, but Maya had been experienced and well prepared. At least, that's what everyone had assumed 9 months ago. Luis traced his finger along the marked trail on the topographic map, but something nagged at him. In her videos, Maya had mentioned being herded away from main trails, forced deeper into the wilderness by her stalker. If that were true, then the original search zones would have been completely wrong. He pulled out the thick file folder containing all the search and rescue documentation from Maya's disappearance. Page after page of grid coordinates, helicopter flight patterns, and ground team reports. Hundreds of volunteer hours spent combing through areas where Maya had never actually been. Idiots, Luis muttered to himself, though he knew the criticism was unfair. Search teams could only work with the information they had, and 9 months ago, no one had known Maya was being hunted. A detail in the search coordinator's notes caught his attention. On day 4 of the search, a team had requested permission to explore a side trail that branched off from Tenaya Canyon, a narrow path that led towards some of the park's more remote cliff systems. The request had been denied because the trail was marked as closed due to erosion hazard. Luis frowned. He'd hiked that trail dozens of times over the years and had never noticed any significant erosion problems. In fact, he was pretty sure it had been open to public use as recently as last summer. He booted up his computer and accessed the park's trail closure database. Every closure required official documentation, environmental assessments, safety reports, supervisor approval. It was a bureaucratic process that generated extensive paperwork. The search for the Tenaya Canyon side trail closure came up empty. No environmental reports. No safety assessments. No supervisor signatures. According to the official database, that trail had never been closed. What the hell? Luis leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. Someone had told the search teams the trail was closed, but no official closure existed. That meant either there had been a miscommunication, or someone had deliberately misdirected the search efforts. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The caller ID showed Maya's mother, Janet Brooks. "Mrs. Brooks," Luis answered, trying to keep his voice steady. "How are you holding up?" "Ranger Delgado, I've been thinking about Maya a lot lately. I know you said you might have found something." Her voice was fragile, hopeful in a way that made Luigi's chest tighten. "We're following up on some new leads," Luis said carefully. "I can't share details yet, but I wanted you to know that we haven't given up on finding answers. I appreciate that more than you know." Janet paused, and Luis could hear her struggling to compose herself. "Actually, I called because I remembered something that might be important. A few weeks before Maya's trip, she mentioned feeling uncomfortable about one of the park rangers." Luis sat up straighter. "Uncomfortable how?" "She said he kept showing up places where she didn't expect to see him. At the visitor center when she was researching trails, at the permit office when she filed her backcountry application. Maya thought maybe he was interested in her romantically, but it made her nervous because he was so much older." "Did she mention his name?" "No, but she described him as tall with graying hair and a mustache. She said he wore a supervisor's badge." Janet's voice grew smaller. "I told her she was probably imagining things. I thought she was being paranoid." Luis felt his pulse quicken. A supervisor who had taken unusual interest in Maya before her trip. Someone with access to permit information and trail closure authority. "Mrs. Brooks, did Maya ever mention this ranger approaching her directly? Speaking to her?" "Once, at the trailhead parking area. Maya said he offered to give her advice about her route, but something about the conversation made her uncomfortable. He knew details about her itinerary that she didn't remember sharing with anyone. After ending the call, Louise sat in the growing darkness of his office, pieces of a horrifying puzzle beginning to form in his mind. A supervisor with access to Maya's permit information. False trail closures that misdirected search efforts. A stalker in a Park Service uniform who knew Maya's name and her planned route. He pulled up the duty roster from Maya's disappearance week, cross-referencing it with the physical descriptions Janet had provided. 3 supervisors matched the general description, but one name made his blood run cold. Owen Talcott. A 15-year veteran who had been promoted to supervisor status just 6 months before Maya's disappearance. Louise remembered Owen as quiet, competent, someone who kept to himself but did solid work. He had graying hair and a mustache, and he stood about 6'2", tall enough to make a 17-year-old girl uncomfortable. Louise accessed Owen's work history and felt his stomach drop. Owen had been present for Maya's permit filing. He had volunteered for search coordination duties during the initial response. And according to the duty logs, he had requested personal time off starting 2 days after Maya was officially declared missing. But the detail that made Louise's hands shake was buried in the search coordination notes. Owen Talcott had been the supervisor who marked the Tenaya Canyon side trail as closed due to erosion, the same trail that had no official closure documentation. The trail that might have led search teams directly to Maya. Louise stared at Owen's employee photo on his computer screen, a routine headshot that showed a pleasant-faced man in his 40s, smiling slightly at the camera. Nothing about the image suggested the capacity for finishing, but Louise had learned long ago that evil rarely announced itself with obvious signs. He reached for his phone to call Superintendent Shin, then hesitated. Owen Talcott had been gone for 9 months. Finding him would require involving federal authorities, and Louise wanted to be absolutely certain before he accused a fellow ranger of finishing. But as he looked again at the trail maps spread across his desk, one thing became crystal clear: Maya Brooks hadn't gotten lost in Yosemite's wilderness. She had been driven there, systematically isolated from any chance of rescue, by someone who knew the park's trail system better than she ever could. Someone who had sworn an oath to protect visitors like her. The betrayal of that trust felt like acid in Louise's throat as he began drafting his report for the federal investigators. Tomorrow, the hunt for Owen Talcott would begin in earnest. Louise arrived at park headquarters before dawn, driven by a restless energy that had kept him awake most of the night. The building felt different in the pre-morning darkness, emptier, more secretive, as if the shadows themselves were hiding evidence of corruption within the Park Service's ranks. He made his way to the communications center, a windowless room lined with radio equipment and filing cabinets that contained years of ranger activity logs. Every radio transmission, every status update, every routine check-in was supposed to be recorded and archived. If Owen Talcott had been stalking Maya during her final days, there should be some record of his movements. The logbooks were organized by date, thick binders with handwritten entries that tracked ranger locations and activities throughout each shift. Louise pulled the volume covering Maya's disappearance week and began searching for Owen's entries. May 15th, Owen logged routine patrol of Valley Loop Trail. May 16th, equipment maintenance at headquarters. May 17th, the day Maya had hiked into the backcountry, Owen was scheduled for administrative duties, office work that should have kept him at headquarters all day. But as Louise turned to May 18th, the day Maya was officially reported missing, he found himself staring at blank pages. "That's impossible," he muttered, flipping through the binder. Every other day had pages of detailed entries, but May 18th was completely empty. Not just Owen's entries. Every single ranger's activities for that day had been removed. Louise pulled out his phone and took photos of the missing pages, then walked to the radio communications archive. Every radio transmission was supposed to be digitally recorded and stored on the park's server system. He logged into the database and searched for audio files from May 18th. No results found. His heart began racing as the implications sank in. Someone with administrative access had systematically erased all official records from the day Maya disappeared. The day that should have contained the most crucial evidence about ranger locations and activities had been wiped clean. "Morning, Luis. You're here early." Luis spun around to find Supervisor Patricia Vega standing in the doorway, coffee cup in hand. Patricia had been with the Park Service for 12 years and was generally regarded as one of the more trustworthy supervisors. If anyone would help him navigate this discovery, it would be her. "Patricia, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Luis gestured toward the empty logbook pages. "Do you remember anything unusual about May 18th last year? Any reason why the radio logs and activity reports might have been removed?" Patricia frowned, setting down her coffee and examining the binder. "This is weird. I've never seen missing entries like this." She looked up at Luis with concern. "What's this about?" Luis explained his investigation into Maya's case, the recovered phone, and his growing suspicions about Owen Talcott. Patricia listened without interruption, her expression growing more troubled with each revelation. "I need to tell you something," Patricia said when Luis finished. "After Maya disappeared, I thought Owen was acting strange. He volunteered for extra search duties, which seemed admirable at the time, but looking back..." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "He was very interested in controlling which areas the search teams covered. He kept redirecting them away from certain zones, always with reasonable-sounding explanations. Do you remember him mentioning keeping tabs on Maya specifically?" Patricia nodded slowly. "Actually, yes. During the initial search briefing, Owen mentioned that he had been keeping an eye on the solo hiker that week. I thought he meant routine safety monitoring, but when pressed for details, he became evasive." Luis felt pieces clicking into place. "When did Owen quit?" 2 days after we called off the active search. He said he got a job offer in Colorado that he couldn't pass up, but the timing seemed odd. Most people don't just abandon 15 years of seniority on a whim. They were interrupted by the arrival of seasonal ranger Marcus Webb, a young man who had worked part-time during the previous summer. Marcus looked nervous as he approached them. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I overheard you talking about Owen Talcott," Marcus said quietly. "I've been thinking about saying something for months, but I wasn't sure if it was important." Luis and Patricia exchanged glances. "What did you want to say, Marcus?" "The day that girl went missing, Maya, I saw Owen heading out toward Tenaya Canyon in one of the park vehicles around noon. He wasn't scheduled for field work that day, and when I asked him about it later, he said he'd been at headquarters all day doing paperwork." Patricia pulled out her phone and began scrolling through old work schedules. "Marcus is right. Owen was assigned administrative duties on May 18th. He had no authorization to take a vehicle into the field." The final piece of the puzzle fell into place in Luis's mind. Owen had erased the radio logs to hide his unauthorized field trip on the day Maya disappeared. He had been stalking her in an official park vehicle, using his supervisor status to access restricted areas and avoid detection by other rangers. "There's something else," Marcus continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "That same day, around evening, I saw Owen's vehicle coming back from the backcountry. The front bumper was damaged, looked like he'd hit a tree or a rock. The next morning, the vehicle was in the maintenance shop for routine repairs, but I never saw any work order." Luis felt his blood turn to ice. A damaged vehicle on the day Maya disappeared. Repairs that weren't officially documented. The implication was too horrifying to fully process. Had Owen used his park vehicle to force Maya off established trails? Had he hunted her through the wilderness like an animal? "We need to contact the FBI immediately," Patricia said, her voice shaking. "This is way beyond what Park Service internal affairs can handle." As Luis nodded agreement, he couldn't shake the image of Maya's terrified face in those final videos. She had been 17 years old, alone in the wilderness, pursued by someone who was supposed to protect her. Someone who had used his position of trust and authority to become her predator. Owen Talcott had disappeared into whatever new life he had built for himself, probably feeling safe behind his false identity and geographic distance. But Luis was about to make sure that safety was an illusion. Maya Brooks deserved justice, and Luis was going to make certain she got it. The hunt for Owen Talcott was about to become a federal manhunt. 3 FBI agents arrived at Yosemite within 12 hours of Luis's call, their black SUVs looking starkly out of place against the park's natural beauty. Agent Rebecca Torres, a slight woman with sharp eyes and an authoritative presence, took immediate control of the investigation. "Ranger Delgado, I need you to walk me through everything you've discovered chronologically," she said, settling into the conference room at park headquarters. "Don't leave out any detail, no matter how insignificant it might seem." Luis had spent the previous evening organizing his findings into a comprehensive timeline, but speaking it aloud to federal agents made the horror of Maya's final days feel even more real. He started with the phone discovery, moved through the video revelations, and concluded with the missing logbook entries and Owen's suspicious vehicle usage. Agent Torres listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on her tablet. When Luis finished, she leaned back in her chair with a grim expression. "We're going to need that phone back from the forensics lab," she said. "Our technical team has more advanced recovery capabilities. If there's any additional data on that device, we'll find it." 2 days later, Torres called Luis with news that made his hands shake. "We recovered partial GPS metadata from Maya's phone. The timestamps don't match her planned itinerary at all." Luis met Torres at the FBI's temporary field office, where she had spread detailed topographic maps across a conference table. Red dots marked Maya's actual locations based on the recovered GPS data, creating a pattern that told a chilling story. "Maya's phone pinged here on May 17th at 6 p.m. Torres pointed to a location near Mirror Lake. "That matches her planned first campsite. But look at this, at 11:30 p.m. the same night, her phone was here." She indicated a spot nearly 2 miles away, deep in unmarked wilderness. "She moved camp in the middle of the night?" Luis studied the map, trying to understand the implications. "It gets worse. On May 18th, her phone shows continuous movement from dawn until late afternoon. Not the steady progress of someone hiking a planned route, erratic movements, doubling back, circling. Classic patterns of someone being pursued." Torres traced Maya's path with her finger, showing a zigzag pattern that spoke of desperation and fear. She was trying to evade someone who knew the terrain better than she did. Every time she headed toward an established trail or ranger station, her movement pattern changes direction. Luis felt sick as he visualized Maya's terror. She was being herded, just like she said in the videos. "The most disturbing part is this," Torres continued, pointing to a cluster of GPS points near the cliff where Luis had found the phone. "Maya's final recorded position was here, at the base of that cliff system. The timestamp shows 3:47 p.m. on May 19th, more than 24 hours after she was officially reported missing. She survived longer than we thought. Much longer. And based on the GPS data, she was moving upward along the cliff face during her final hours. The question is why?" Luis studied the topographic lines, understanding dawning on him with horrible clarity. She was trying to hide the phone. Maya knew she wasn't going to make it out alive, so she climbed as high as she could to hide the evidence where her finisher wouldn't think to look. Torres nodded grimly. "That's our assessment as well. Maya Brooks spent her final hours not trying to escape, but trying to ensure her story would eventually be told." The FBI had also made progress in tracking Owen Talcott's movements after he left Yosemite. He drove straight to Colorado after his resignation, but he didn't stay there long. Torres explained. "We found employment records showing he worked at Rocky Mountain National Park for 6 months under his real name, then disappeared from official records." "You think he's using a false identity now?" "Almost certainly. But people like Owen can't completely change their nature. We're checking employment records at national parks throughout the western states, looking for new hires with Owen's skill set and physical description." Torres pulled out a file folder containing Owen's original employment records. "We also discovered something interesting in his background check from 15 years ago. 2 complaints were filed against him during his probationary period, both by young female hikers who reported feeling uncomfortable with his behavior. The complaints were dismissed as misunderstandings. Luis felt anger building in his chest. So the Park Service knew he had problems with young women and did nothing? The complaints were vague, and Owen had excellent performance reviews otherwise. In hindsight, they looked like early warning signs, but at the time, Torres shrugged helplessly. The system failed Maya long before she ever set foot in Yosemite. As if summoned by their conversation, Torres's phone rang. She answered it with a curt, "Torres here," then listened intently for several minutes. Luis watched her expression grow more focused as the conversation continued. "That was our field office in Utah," she said after hanging up. "They found Owen Talcott." Luis's heart raced. "Where?" "Zion National Park. He's been working there for the past 4 months under the name Owen Taylor, close enough to his real name that he'd respond naturally, but different enough to avoid casual detection. Park rangers there describe him as quiet, competent, someone who keeps to himself. Just like he was here," Luis said quietly. "The Utah team is moving to arrest him this afternoon. They're treating it as a high-priority operation because of the nature of the crimes." Torres began gathering her maps and files. "Ranger Delgado, I want you to know that without your discovery of that phone, Maya's case would have remained cold forever. Owen Talcott would have continued working in national parks, potentially targeting other young women." As Torres packed up the FBI's temporary command center, Luis found himself thinking about Maya's parents. Soon, they would have answers to questions that had tormented them for 9 months. The answers wouldn't bring Maya back, but they might provide the closure that had seemed impossible just a week ago. Maya Brooks had been 17 years old, alone, and terrified in her final days. But her determination to hide that phone had ultimately become Owen Talcott's downfall. Even in death, Maya had found a way to identify her finisher. The arrest took place at dawn on a Tuesday morning, as Owen Talcott prepared for another day of deceiving his colleagues at Zion National Park. FBI agents surrounded the modest trailer where he'd been living under his false identity, their tactical gear a stark contrast to the peaceful Utah desert landscape. Luis watched the arrest footage later that day from the FBI field office in Fresno, Agent Torres narrating the key moments as they unfolded on screen. Owen emerged from his trailer looking older than his 47 years, his hair now completely gray, his face bearing the weathered lines of someone who had been running from his conscience for 9 months. He didn't resist, Torres noted as they watched Owen raise his hands and submit to handcuffs with the resignation of a man who had always known this moment would come. Sometimes they fight. Sometimes they run. But Owen just looked tired. The federal charges were extensive: obstruction of justice, destruction of records, abuse of federal authority, and, most seriously, first-degree crime. The evidence was overwhelming. Beyond Maya's phone videos and the GPS data, forensic teams had recovered Owen's original park vehicle from a salvage yard in Colorado. Hidden beneath layers of hasty bodywork, they found traces of Maya's DNA and fibers from her hiking clothes. "He tried to cover his tracks," Torres explained. "But you can't completely erase evidence like that. The vehicle told the story of Maya's final struggle." 3 weeks after Owen's arrest, Luis found himself sitting across from Maya's parents in the same conference room where this nightmare had begun. Janet Brooks looked older, more fragile than when Luis had last seen her, but there was something different in her eyes, not peace, exactly, but the absence of the desperate uncertainty that had haunted her for 9 months. "We wanted to thank you personally," Janet said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks, "for never giving up on Maya." David Brooks, Maya's father, spoke for the first time since entering the room. "The FBI showed us the videos. Our daughter, she was so brave. Even when she knew she was going to die, she made sure her finisher would be caught." Agent Torres had prepared them carefully for what Maya's recovered videos contained, but Luis could only imagine the mixture of heartbreak and pride that Maya's parents must have felt watching their daughter's final messages. Maya had died alone and afraid, but she had not died helplessly. "The case officially closed yesterday," Torres announced, pulling out a thick folder of legal documents. Owen Talcott pled guilty to all charges in exchange for a life sentence without possibility of parole. He'll spend the rest of his life in federal prison. Luis had expected to feel more satisfaction at that moment, but instead he found himself thinking about all the ways the system had failed Maya. The dismissed complaints from other young women. The lack of oversight that allowed Owen to abuse his authority. The culture of trust within the Park Service that had made it easier for a predator to hide among protectors. There's one more thing, Torres continued. Owen provided information about Maya's final resting place as part of his plea agreement. A recovery team located her remains yesterday. The silence in the room was profound. After 9 months of not knowing, Maya's parents would finally be able to bring their daughter home. Janet Brooks broke down completely then, her composed facade crumbling as the reality hit her. Maya was really gone. There would be no miraculous rescue, no sudden reappearance with an incredible survival story. Just the hard, permanent truth of loss and the small comfort of finally knowing what had happened. She'll be buried next to her grandmother, David said quietly. Maya always loved visiting there. It's peaceful. 6 months later, Luis stood at Maya's graveside during the 1-year anniversary of her disappearance. The headstone was simple granite, engraved with Maya's name, dates, and a single line. She made sure the truth was told. Maya's story had sparked a comprehensive review of Park Service hiring practices and oversight procedures. New protocols were implemented for monitoring employee interactions with visitors, and a confidential reporting system was established for complaints about staff behavior. It was small comfort for Maya's family, but it might prevent future tragedies. Luis placed a small bouquet of wildflowers, the kind Maya had loved to photograph, beside the headstone. The case was closed, justice had been served, but the weight of Maya's courage would stay with him forever. A 17-year-old girl, facing certain death, had used her final hours not to despair but to ensure her finisher would face consequences. Maya Brooks had solved her own finishing, reaching from beyond death to deliver justice through the damaged phone that Luis had found wedged in granite 200 feet above the valley floor. As Luis walked away from the cemetery, he thought about all the other missing persons cases that remained unsolved, all the families still waiting for answers. Maya's story was finished, but the fight for justice continued. The mountain always kept its secrets, but sometimes, just sometimes, it gave them back.